In the 2016 US election, Donald Trump won the vote by a narrow margin. But despite this, since he had the electoral majority, he could issue things like executive orders using his power to do things like banning trans people from the military and issuing 50 executive orders in his first day of office, repealing virtually all of Obama's policies the previous term. We believe that this kind of disproportionate power is something we simply cannot stand for in this debate, and believe that under the current system, without giving the proper checks and balances to the minority party, we're living in an undemocratic system that simply does not have the people's best interests at heart. I've got two main substantive here today, one a more principled point about how this is undemocratic, and two, a point about how this actually improves the political process as a whole. So, for my first substantive, right, I'm going to be talking about how, ironically, this is actually a pretty undemocratic way to run our system. Because in the current political system, today, the winner of an election, the group with a majority, has all the power. 60% can't implement 60% of what they want, but instead 100%, leveraging their majority to pass bills that they want in Congress or through other means like executive orders. When we get margins like 52%, this becomes even more absurd. And generally speaking, in democratic election cycles, we do see the results fluctuating around that 50 to 60% mark. We believe that we can win on the principled claim that democracy is an inherently good thing, as it leads to people getting more freedom in their lives, and that we can prove that this is a more democratic system. So how do we, on our side of the house, make the system more democratic? Well, by instituting processes like having a large supermajority needed for bills with over a certain price tag, or bills that change the Constitution, for an example, radical change can't be passed without bipartisan support, and therefore a radical majority. This means that we're not living in a system where the votes of up to 50% of the population are just pretty much completely discarded, and millions are left feeling angry and disenfranchised by the system we've got today. Therefore, by giving minority parties major roles in the cabinet and the decision-making process, we can get the 40% of the vote getting 40% of the choice. The alternative in the current system is that these people don't get heard. They get more radical. They become more uncharitable to those on the other side of the political spectrum. And they feel that the current system simply can't stand for what they believe in. We believe that this is an inherently bad thing. It's undemocratic. It discards so many people's votes, and it leads to radical change that isn't actually popular enough for it to get changed to be passed under the current system. So now that we've demonstrated that, I'd like to demonstrate how this actually improves the political system as a whole through 3 different mechanisms. Mechanism number 1, on our side of the house, we can prove more bipartisanship and representation in the system of Parliament and Congress. Because when bipartisanship becomes enshrined in the system as an institutional necessity, we get more representational policy for the nation as a whole. We're going to give you 3 reasons for why this is true. A, neither side gets anything they really want without a give or take method. This leads to mutually assured destruction if you don't cooperate with the other side. If both sides have total control over whether or not what you want gets passed or not passed, this means that if you try to stop this type of behavior, then you're never going to get anything you'd ever want passed. And because of this mutually assured destruction system, we're never going to see any of this partisanship take place like we do in the current system. This, for an example, if the Republicans, if Democrats really want some form of social progress through welfare, and Republicans really want a process of giving businesses more fair taxes, neither side will ever be able to get anywhere on these very urgent issues, and this mutually assured destruction thing would take place, leading to neither side pushing these radical agendas. Reason number 2 is that in a society when bipartisanship is the norm, like it says in the mood, to break from this norm and ignore the other parties is deeply unpopular and considered deeply radical, both because it's breaking voter expectations, and 2, it's stalling the democratic process somewhat, and also potentially leading to this mutually assured destruction mechanism. And so because of this, we believe we're going to be getting a more give or take type system where people can implement most of what they want if you're in the majority. But if there's something the minority really doesn't want to push forward, they'll be able to stop it. And if there's something the minority is really passionate about, something that's really important to their voters, they'll be able to push it forward. And when we get legislation, it will be a lot more of a mix of both parties' agendas, the best of both worlds, put forward into a more fair and equitable system. Why is this good? Well, A, as we've just told you, this means that bills will have a mix of the best ideas from both sides. B, more citizens will be happy with the outcomes as they feel that both parties have been consulted in this process. C, policy won't be repealed instantly the moment the other side wins in this really polarized system, like with Donald Trump in the first example I gave you. And finally, right, if there's something that 40% of the population is really hurt by, like a racist policy instituted by a majority conservative, potentially, government in a more backwards type country, then if the minority and more liberal party really opposes this, they can really put their foot down and stop it, even though there's like a 60% majority for this racist majority party. I'll take a POI now if you've got one.
Do you think voters would ever be satisfied? Do you think voters would ever be satisfied when they can't come with like a collective decision?
We believe we'll be more likely to get more decisions for all the mechanisms I just explained, and also because of the second point that I'm going to come out with, which is that there will be less polarization in this system. Because under the current system, polarization is this acid that's corrosive to democracy, and it's eating through our system as a whole and our institutions. Collaboration is going downhill. People on both sides of the political aisle are becoming more radical and more angry, and there's more aggressive rhetoric and upset people. And so we believe we can stop this type of polarization through three mechanisms. Mechanism number one is that this type of collaboration, when we see as people that, say, Jacinta Ardern and Simon Bridges are collaborating, working together up top, then you're going to be less likely with the people. Then you're going to be more likely to want to collaborate with the people down bottom that you're interacting with in general day-to-day life. Two, as we've explained, it's going to be really unpopular for you to be super polarized as a politician due to the mutually assured destruction mechanisms we've come out with it earlier. And three, right? Generally speaking, if you're a politician, you're not going to be putting forward polarizing rhetorics like Donald Trump did or Hillary, or most politicians do nowadays, insulting the other side, because you're going to need that other side in 6 months when you win the election. And if you don't have them on your side, you can't suddenly go, hey, sorry, I called you a communist fascist 6 months ago. Can you help me out with this bill? It's simply not going to happen. And three, we're going to bring an extra... And because of these benefits, we're going to see less polarization. We're going to see more productive political process using the best ideas from both parties. And we're going to have a more democratic system as a whole that helps everyone in the world, not just the top 51%. And because of this, we believe we're the party of democracy. Thank you.
Yeah.
The negotiating team has failed to show us and to mechanize to us how the compromises between two inherently opposed parties is going to gain any benefits on their side when the stakes are raised, like in terms of like the outcomes which they get when deliberating over things which are going to affect an entire country. So I'm going to have a lot of integrated rebuttal in this speech. Firstly, a few upfront things, but like particularly on this principle about like it being undemocratic, that like 40% of people don't get their way. We tell you, first of all, like there's an election in like 3 to 4 years in every country, right? It's not like they're just locked in for like decades after like this one decision is made. We also tell you that it's like democratic in that like the majority has literally been voted in by their people in that sense. We also tell you that parties get better outcomes. That's the reason why they're voted in. When you get like collective backing of one party in particular, that's how you start getting policies pushed through, because people are backing one party. They can like group their motivation and like their incentives to get things pushed. That's why there's like collective backing of particular parties, as opposed to just having a bunch of people shouting at each other as to how best to like get their way. So a lot of integrated rebuttal, I'm going to tell you what our word looks like firstly, then how the harms to the decision-making process, all at odds with what we've been told by F. Secondly, on how this exacerbates political division. Now, in terms of the world which we support, we tell you that like there will still be an opposition in our side, and like they're still going to be heard, but they're not going to have like that same level of like political capital or political sway. What we tell you is that there still remains the incentive for parties in position of power to literally like make the right calls, right? They still require like the support of the public in order to like get voted in again. Again, that contends with like this democratic like idea. You still want to do the right thing to represent the population because you know that you would like need them to get like voted in the next 3 to 4 years. They're not just locked into this like undemocratic system where literally nobody is heard. Like every voter has got an equal sway on what happens at the next election, irrespective of whether they were in like that 60% or not. Also, we tell you that like they will still factor in opposition arguments as a result, so as to lessen their criticism as well. So we tell you 5 mechanisms as to why we tell you this exacerbates why this causes harms to the decision-making process. Firstly, is we tell you literally the length of time, like to decide on courses of action increases. What like AF needs to understand is that these two parties are literally going to have to like work with each other, literally to like come up with policies, to come up with ways they're going to the ways they're going to combat things. It's not just a matter of whether they both like agree on one thing which has been put forward to them. It's literally up to them to like put forward policy. And like what we tell you is that like now you have to satisfy both parties. Like you have to like they both have to come up with like, or multiple parties have to like come up with an agreement on what to do. What we tell you, this is particularly harmful for issues which are like immediately pressing and need to be addressed like right now. Well, like the example we give you is like, imagine if Labour and National were both like debating each other as to what to do with like COVID-19 into the country, right? Like such like in like cases like that where like there are such polarizing views, it's like going to take such a long time to even decide what to do. And even worse, like these really pressing issues, especially with COVID, where like people's lives were literally at stake. Secondly, on the difficulty to actually come up with a compromise, we tell you this is like especially the case for like big issues with like huge variations in views. For example, like the course of action to take for climate change, like it's going to be so difficult to satisfy both parties, like when there's such like variation in the like correct course of action to take. Thirdly, then on like the watering down of this like of decision making, this is in like direct this is in direct contention with like the affirmative team's like suggestion that like parties can get like most of what everyone wants and they can get like more representational policy. What we tell you is that like when compromising on like two like very opposing issues, like they're going to have to compromise between like the two extremes, which like both parties bring forward. What we tell you is that doesn't actually achieve the aims which both parties started with, like to achieve like their targets at either side, right? They have to compromise. We tell you that those targets which they like identified when coming into the negotiations aren't actually going to be the ones getting the benefits, because now they have to settle like on the in between. This is like particularly the case, like the example which have been given about like where to delegate spending. When two parties want to target like two completely different groups, neither of them are going to get those benefits when they literally like need X amount of money, because now they have to compromise. We also tell you literally, and again in this in contention with like this idea about being democratic, we literally tell you that the population's voice is going to be less weighty in negotiations. Why do I tell you this? Well, we tell you because like because the population, it's like what they support literally has to be negotiated to support like either side. So we tell you like the population might like there might be like 80-90% all really like supporting like what like one party stance on a particular issue, but that party still has to negotiate with their opposition in order to decide what to do. So like the impact of that is you've literally got less weight, but like literally like the say which the population would otherwise have like cleanly on our side of the house literally has to get negotiated down in order to satisfy the opposition party. That is like hugely undemocratic in and of itself. The impacts of this is the public is literally going to lose like trust and faith in the decision-making process, right? They're going to have little decision-making, like little incentive to like engage in politics because they see how long the decision-making process takes, how complex it is, like literally having to satisfy like two opposition parties. And like also nobody is truly going to feel like happy or satisfied with the decisions when literally every time something's put forward, they have to compromise and not actually be able to achieve those target aims which either like opposing parties came in to begin with. I will take a POI between points if you have one.
In the 2000 US election, George Bush won due to essentially 300 votes in one county in Florida. Afterwards, he was able to pass unpopular legislation like the Patriot Act, even though he barely won with no opposition through executive orders. What would you do about this under your side of the house?
Well, what we tell you is there's going to be more harmful, like there's going to be more harms on your side of the house when you've got like opposition, both like throwing like really radical ideas, trying to get their ways like in the compromises. That's what I'm going to show you on why this exacerbates political division on my second substantive right now. First mechanism as to why like political division is exacerbated. We tell you that parties, when they're in opposition with each other, when they're both given a platform, literally have to be more radical for decisions to be made in their favor. We tell you that parties are going to go to the extreme to like drag that compromise like more favorably onto their side in order to align with their views. This looks like a party presenting a much more radical outlook on a view, just so they can like perhaps drag that compromise more onto their side. Like even though they might not like truly believe what they're suggesting, they will make it more radical in order to get their like original incentive. Secondly, we tell you that there's literally going to be higher stakes placed on either side stance. Like we tell you that like the arguments between opposing parties are literally what is going to be determining what passes now. This looks like right and left wing parties arguments are going to be like even more fueled up to try and get their way when they're now made equal. Now like that debate gets even like more fueled up, even like more ruthless because they're like the ones making the decision-making process, like deciding what they're actually going to do. Thirdly, we tell you that the population is going to join in with this more extreme like division between the political parties in power. This is like more polarizing, creates like the civil unrest, intolerance, like the same impacts which we are shown on the affirmative side. We also tell you fourthly is that people parties are going to feel frustrated and resentful toward their opposition. They feel like they're being held down by like their opposition, not allowing them to truly like reach their goals. That causes like resentment, intolerance. That's why we're so proud to negate on our side of the house.
I think the root cause of most of the petty political division that we currently see in society is not because we can have the ability for compromise on our side of the house. It is because parties feel powerless as they can do nothing to oppose a majority party implementing legislation. They can have no say in the process, no say in claiming the benefits of passing this good legislation. And the only thing they can do while they're in the minority is attack this party, paint them as a bad faith actor, paint them as this legislation is terrible, and draw like polarization to the extent. I think this is something that is uniquely perpetrated on their side of the house. I'm going to chat about three things. Firstly, on the principle of democratic representation. Secondly, on polarization. Then thirdly, on the capability to pass like legislation in a good and helpful way. Firstly, on the principle. We told you on the principle and the comparative on what side Neg has to defend. We do not see a true democratic system insofar as that 51% can basically override like the overriding like democratic like beliefs of everyone else, and the 49% can simply be cast aside, and they have no capability to like actually have a say in their future through like their ability to exercise their vote, and B, they can be ruled through the tyranny of a majority. What do we hear in response to this principle? We first heard some mitigatory lines about how like this is only 3 years long, this there's only 3 years long when they're out of power, and it's not like that bad for these people. We give two responses. Firstly, we tell you that 3 years is still a sizable amount of time for people to be left out of the democratic process. During that time, legislation could be passed that brings massive harms to them, and they have absolutely no capability to present it. And secondly, we told you that this is just the 3 years of time is generally an uncharitable characterization, as it means as like the party wins year after year. So I think on the grounds of that, most of the material with respect to like these people being left out of the democratic process still stands. The next response is that these parties have these altruistic kind of incentives to like actively like do what most of the public wants, and they're not going to act in undemocratic ways. I note two things. I think the party only needs to represent 51% of people within like a given like population to maintain a voter. They have absolutely no incentive to like probably the 40% on the margins, as this is not where their voter base lies. So they can simply like cast these people aside and do absolutely nothing to represent them, and absolutely do nothing to like actually uplift them and benefit them in this debate. The final response we heard was that we're going to see like more watered down watered down legislation like that has more compromise, and they try to paint this as a bad thing. We tell you that this is a good thing, because even if it is slightly more watered down, we at least have like a wide range of opinions when it comes to like what this legislation looks like on both sides of the house. So I think at the end of that, we get more people involved in the democratic like process. We get less people disenfranchised because they now feel that their votes are actually counting even if their party doesn't win. We get more people turning out to vote. We get more people having legislation that brings direct benefits to them, irrespective of if they're in the minority or not. So I think that top level principle analysis still stands. Next, let's talk about polarization, because I think most of the polarization stuff actually feeds into the capability for legislation to happen. I'm going to give you like 4 reasons here as to why we don't actually believe polarization is going to happen on our side of the house. Firstly, at a top level within government, we're going to see like more compromise happening. We're going to see like Jacinda Ardern and like maybe Simon Bridges like working together on legislation, being in each other's cabinets, and more bills like passed in a unanimous manner as these politicians kind of like vote like for the same legislation. What this means is that when people like and these voters like look up to these individuals, they see very similarly to them, and they're more likely to like support and want to act in a similar kind of like politically like unitist kind of way. Secondly, we tell that like removes any incentives to attack other parties insofar as it paints you as an extremely bad faith actor insofar as this party is literally reaching out a hand to compromise and like work together, and you're just like being like really like egregious in attacking them. Thirdly, we told you that like if you like act in there's like no longer an incentive to want to attack these parties because they're like providing you with the opportunity for support. I'm going to extend here and say that like bring back to what I said in the introduction, that most of like the reasons as to why like political parties like attack and like push this extremely polarized rhetoric is simply because they have no capability to actually do anything within the democratic process, because they simply just do not have enough to form the majority on their side of the house. What this means is they engage in extremely like extremely divisive rhetoric to try and convince people that what's happening on the other side of the house is completely wrong. Whereas if they're engaging within the process and they are part of like passing the bills, they're part of the cabinet, it's a lot harder for them to actually paint it in a good light, because A, they have like some say in the process, and B, like they're also painting themselves in a bad light when they do this. In terms of like the impacting and polarization, this wasn't quite got to by Ethan, but I think this also applies kind of like at a day-to-day level. It passes on to people, discrimination, like extremism and unity. What do we hear from them in terms of political like division. We kind of heard that parties are going to go to extremes to try and like force a compromise in. I thought this was like not enough for two reasons. Firstly, on the ground that both parties just push to extremes, surely what this means is that we're just going to similarly like see a real the center's just going to remain the same insofar as that both pull out to the sides. The second response is that both parties go to the extreme. They simply alienate their voter bases because they asserted that people were going to be willing to follow these parties to the extreme. We tell you they're probably not, and they'll probably be like a new opportunist party that wants to capture like this middle voter bases as these two parties like pull to the extreme, and they're incentivized against it because it literally like pushes away like the voters. Right. So I think on the grounds of that, we're ahead on most of this polarization and we reduce polarization. I think a good lead on from this into like stuff getting done is that most of this polarization stuff actually folds into like the capability for stuff to get done, because now as society is less polarized, it's no longer seen as like a politically like good it's no longer seen as like a good strategy within elections to paint like the other party is useless and use like this extremely charged polarized attacks on them to try and gain voters, because it's like we're no longer polarized and we no longer see this rhetoric surrounding it. And further to this, we just say, so we just simply, so you no longer campaign on like pushing for these polarized things, and instead like parties are generally more willing to compromise on these issues. I'll take a POI quickly.
Isn't it in the best interest of parties in power to set policies to appeal to opposing voters in hopes of getting re-elected?
No, because then they lose like their own voter base, and like I think that probably if they do like create a legislation for like other parties, I think people would still vote for like the party that best aligns with it and has broader policies that support them. I'm unsure what that's getting at. Right, leading on from this stuff about like the capability for stuff to get done, I just want to note like two things on this premise. Firstly, I just say it sounds like an intuitive thing, like the intuitively good, like bad thing that's never stuff isn't going like getting done. We think it's like a good part of a democracy. We pull back to the principle and how these discussions are key on getting people's voices represented and seeing more like broader beliefs. The second thing is that like we believe that like most big issues such as like COVID relief is probably going to be passed irrespective of it's not going to be like something that has like massive division and massive stalling, as both parties has incentives to look good on this. The final like kind of note here at a top level would be that I think like most of the stuff about stuff not getting done is symmetric. I think it happens in like a less obvious way on their side of the house. What it looks like is one party being in the majority one year, and then they pass this legislation, and the other parties in the majority next year, they repeal this legislation. It's simply a back and forth where nothing gets done, but it's not in like kind of like a clear-cut way, and these parties just go back and forth. We think that in our world, they pass legislation in kind of like a cooperative kind of way, and we simply just do not see this back and forth. Finally, on incentives, why they shouldn't stall. I've got like 5 here. First, you just appear bad faith. If you're stalling, you lose votes. Secondly, both parties like want to look good and they're both willing to cooperate. Thirdly, we tell you that there is kudos from being the compromising party to the public. You look like good faith. You look like you're taking the high ground. Fourthly, you want to be a co-sponsor on good legislation. Fifthly, the stuff about mutually assured destruction makes it harder for you to like pass legislation into next year. And we just say, as a consequence of this, we believe that there are incentives not to stall. Thank you.
Yep.
3, 2, 1. Bipartisan coalitions are lovely in theory. In practicality, they have never and will never work because these fundamental differences between these parties are always at odds. This means that achievements such as policy change simply cannot ever be reached by a majority party when they have to try and form compromises. First off, I just want to provide some rebuttal on why we would still cater to the centrist audience rather than spreading to like radicalized ideas. So we would say that on margins, for example, 48% and 52%, the swing vote is exactly what empowers the winning team. They want to cater to these centrists and they also want to continue to cater to their own party, obviously. I think it's pretty clear that even when they start to cater towards centrists, their entire fan base isn't going to switch over, as the second tried to claim. Thus, we actually cater towards the individuals regardless because they decide, right? They cater what majority is in charge. So we would say what happens under your system is that everyone loses. No policy is actually being passed because in reality, compromises cannot be made on fundamental things. You cannot have tax cuts being implemented at the same time as increased social welfare, which is the reality of what happens when we try to, compromise for everyone. When we try to have David Seymour and Jacinda Ardern both being in power at the same time, they simply cannot be, and thus nothing happens. Okay, I want to make that super clear. So you don't win via Democrats when nothing changes, because in reality that will always cater to the Conservatives, which is what I'm going to get onto now. So when no policies are actually being passed, we would say that Conservatives are always winning. Progressives want to pass new policies, and when nothing is changing, Conservatives are able to implement stuff that was still happening in the past and needs to be repealed. If Trump had sat there and done nothing, if he hadn't acted on climate change because no one else was, because there was no if Biden had sat there and done nothing, he hadn't acted on climate change, he hadn't passed policies repealing what was done in the past by the olden days, which were in terms far more conservative, we would say the Conservatives are winning because there is literally no progression of society. We cannot keep up with how the world is changing when we don't introduce new policies, which is the entire purpose of the majority of progressive parties. So we would say that the one party is always winning, which makes it inherently unfair, particularly when this party has the majority in the first place. So we would also say why we wouldn't the other team tried to say that we wouldn't stall. I think it's pretty clear on our case that we weren't saying that they would necessarily intentionally stall, which they do, by the way, but it doesn't actually make any difference when they don't intentionally stall, because in reality, they're never going to give up on what they stand for. And what they stand for is consistent. It's never going to change. They are stubborn. They stand for their radical views, and they can never come to a general consensus. We'd say bureaucratic processes are already incredibly lengthy, and you're just making it even harder to get any sort of new implementation in the first place. We would also say that actually doesn't happen. Republicans continuously stall elections and being acted upon, and for people never having any progression within society. So let's look at why policy is not going to be repealed instantly as soon as it switches. First off, we would say this is not inherently a bad thing for these terrible policies, which are never going to be overturned on your side, because let's be real, these were implemented hundreds of years ago, and the Republican and Conservative parties are never going to give up on them. So this actively limits progression. We would also say if a party is consistently winning, these policies would stay in place, and this is better than the policies never being passed in the first place. If a party is consistently winning, I think it's a pretty clear indication that they have support from the majority, and the democratic processes are occurring at the right levels, because they are able to succeed. They're able to cater to that centrist audience as well as their as well as their progressive audience. So let's look at stuff not actually getting done and all the harms that this brings. So we would say in the examples of COVID, if they hadn't been able to come to a consensus, millions of people would have, thousands of people would have died, right? If people don't have quick action on climate change, then the world is going to be in a very terrible place. So we need policies, right? We need to have things being passed, because when we don't, we are losing. We're on the back foot. So I will take a POI before I move on.
Do you think the National Party would want to be known as the party that continuously blocked legislation and never let anything pass?
Yeah, because that's like what they do. Like, I think it's pretty clear that the ACT Party like stands for keeping up conversion therapy and that kind of thing. The like National Party stood for keeping up conversion therapy and not introducing any new policy. It's pretty clear that they like stand for policies not changing because that's the entire basis of their views. This isn't like a controversial take here. That's just reality. We would also say for immensely radical actions such as like things that like need to be changed within 3 years, there's going to be literal rioting in the streets, right? No one's going to stand for these things. It's all going to potentially be an impeachment. I'm never getting voted in again. Okay, if the majority of parties want to be consistently voted in, they want to have a good reputation, they're not going to stand for ridiculous policies that don't support anyone and particularly don't cater to the centrists, particularly when, again, they rely on that centrist vote as they do in swing votes. So we would also say that if policies are watered down, they will not be good. The majority of people want climate policies. The majority of people don't want to die from COVID. We would say that when the majority want something, they're not able to achieve it because of the need to cater and compromise to every voice involved. If the majority want something, the democratic process should ensure that they are getting it. If the majority of people are like wanting something, I think it's pretty clear that they deserve to get it. They don't deserve to be halted at every stage of the process because of the compromises needed to be made. Now I'm going to finally look at why they will still insult each other and belittle the cases that they provide. We would say the exact reason that they must resort to this belittling is when the reality is that all of their cases boil down to the same fundamental positions. Conservatives would rather say that Democrats are pedophiles because they don't want to admit that they will never compromise on gay rights. They would have the space to do this too. They would have the space to have their voice be heard out and actually seem like a reasonable opinion because we're supposed to be hearing everyone's argument. In reality, we allow them to radicalize when we don't like acknowledge the fundamental differences between these parties. So overall, you do not honor democracy. The majority voted for these parties. They want the policies that these parties aim to enact. No one wants watered down bills, not the conservatives, not the like progressives. No one wants them. No one benefits from them. There's no actual change going on. Opposition parties can be more extreme, they can be more steadfast. They don't need to win people over because they're no longer reliant on the election process, and the people's voice no longer matters because like a party winning by a supermajority doesn't actually make that much of a difference on your side of the house. So where you lose is when there are clear majorities, which is, by the way, the majority of situations that we're in. We would say the world's getting far more progressive and that the like conservative parties are generally catering to wider audiences as a whole. So what we would say is that no one gets the policies that they want when there are clear majorities. Super and major majorities are largely ignored within these institutions practically. For example, in Northern Ireland, where the majority of people didn't want to partake in Brexit, they had to because they have a coalition government. We would also say that when progressives are in the majority, they are losing every time. So overall, this is why we cannot stand for affirmative.
Can I start when ready? I think side F lost this debate. Side neg lost this debate the second they chose not to engage with what is the core and most crucial issue of this debate, which is the principal claim that the current system is undemocratic, wherein you have a party winning by 1% and being able to force through their agenda through executive action because they won one county in Florida by 300 votes. Three things in this speech today. Firstly, I'm going to explaining why fairness is the most important issue in this debate. Then I'm going to be moving on to polarization and the effectiveness of legislation. Okay. Why is fairness the most important issue? Firstly, why is fairness the most important issue? We tell you that fairness is the most important issue. And when we win this fairness claim, we win the debate as a whole, since like the benefits from fairness flow down to the other points of clash, even though they stand independent. And like fairness is just top level analysis insofar that we get a more democratic system. Okay, why is fairness the most important thing? First of all, we determine that everyone's voice is heard, which is so important since the goal of democracy is to make everyone's voice heard. And when you have like Donald Trump not winning the popular vote, but still winning the election and then being able to force through in one day, just like repeal Obama's entire like campaign and his entire legislation in one day through executive orders. That's something that happens on their side of the house, where they don't have this collaboration, where they have this increased polarization order that we don't get on their side of the house. Secondly, we don't give unilateral power to one party to sign like unpopular bills where they have like no opposition, since they can just push every bill through since they have a 51% majority. Thirdly, we reduce the impact of fluke or like narrow elections where it's like one party just narrowly wins and they can now enforce their agenda since like they won by 1%. And then fourthly, we just see increased cooperation insofar as that we now have both parties involved in the political process more. And then we see that parties will no longer only target one group or one like side, since they need to win the support of everyone. And then sixthly, we just see more democratic process and democracy is good. I'll note on this, we have absolutely no response at all to the principal claim. And I think we win the debate off that alone because we've outlined quite clearly about tyranny of majority and the abuse of like the majority through executive orders and whatever. So we win off this alone. I'll take your POI now.
So when practically bipartisan coalitions consistently still cater to the majority, would you say that they're being democratic?
Well, I think the core difference is when you have like only one party involved in the decision making, even if they've narrowly won, they can still push through your agenda. But when you have like a couple of people from the other party involved who can like black hat it and like compromise or whatever, then you get a more representative thing that involves more viewpoints. Okay, now I'll just cover legislation quickly because I think that's where the core of their case lies. All their case is based on like proving we have better legislation. Okay, what do they say here? I think their main thing here, they bring about stalling. I think we just tell you that stalling won't be as present as they think it, as they're characterizing it to be on our side of the house. Since like when you're stalling and like all these socially norms or social, and like as the motion says, all these social norms about like bipartisanship or whatever are normalized, that if you're like acting like bad faith, you'll just look like a terrible person and like a bad politician. Insofar as that you're like blocking popular agenda. And then we also talked about like mutually assured destruction. If one party is engaging in this behavior, the other party will engage with it. So neither party will engage with it since they like know that the other party will do it to them and whatever. And then we just tell you that on the comparative, whereas instead of it's like actual discussion creating on our side of the house, since you have these people like involved in like the boardroom meetings, I think the comparative on their side of the house is stuff like the filibuster or whatever is weaponized by parties to make sure that no bill is passed whatsoever instead of the compromise. I think we've quite clearly shown we get on our side of the house. And then thirdly, we just say parties won't like do this since they lose votes in like the margins in the center or whatever at the point in time where they stall all these popular votes. Then secondly, they tell us that like old policies will never get overturned. We just tell you that society will generally get socially more progressive and like people will just vote in more and more of politicians who like oppose like really regressive policies on the whole. And then they told us that like the majority bills won't get passed, which seems like oddly contradictory to what they just asked in that POI, but I'll engage anyway. First of all, a compromise will be reached since the majority wants something. The other party will have to compromise, otherwise they'll get flamed by the majority. Secondly, we tell you that the alternative is nothing passed at all, since you don't have the cooperation we stand for on our side of the house. Instead of like a compromise being reached, you'll just have like the Republicans or whatever filibustering and whatever to prolong the vote and like lobbyists or whatever buying votes while they filibuster to make sure this isn't passed. And then secondly, we just tell you that if you like disrupt the political process in like such a severe degree, you'll be voted out since you'll be flamed by the media and just generally seen as a terrible person. Then they told us that like, oh, but legislation will be seen since you'll be able to be voted in 4 years or whatever. In like 4 years, Donald Trump added $5 trillion to public debt, cost millions of lives in the COVID pandemic or whatever, because he didn't even win the majority vote, but because of what they stand for, he is able to just push through every single piece of his legislation or whatever. And then they tell us that nothing is done. Once again, I'll just link back to my analysis about stalling. Like on their side house, they just have the filibuster being weaponized and stuff like that. And then when we get more input from opposition parties from day one, parties won't be engaging in like the filibuster and stuff. So we don't get that. And then they get like watering that won't be passed, but it likely won't be passed since like all this polarization is existing. And secondly, like if they do get passed, they'll just be have to be a compromise anyways. Because of this polarization, it's hard for one party to win out over the other.
I think you just cut off there for a second. So yeah, it wasn't. So could you maybe go back about 30 seconds if that's okay, and just go from where you were? I think it happened to other people as well. Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. It wasn't very long. It was just about 30 seconds.
Okay. Do I get like more time or?
Yeah, you can have more time to compensate for the.
Okay.
Wait, yeah, like you can have 30 more seconds on your speech if that's okay. If that's fine with everyone. Yeah.
Okay. Then, yeah. I'll restart now.
Yeah. Don't restart your whole speech. Just go back.
I like restart from 30 seconds ago. I mean.
Yeah. You're talking about like the filibuster and that sort of thing being weaponized when you froze.
Okay, yeah. So once again, like the filibuster we weaponize because we don't have this like this opportunity for the parties to compromise. We'll just see them like filibustering since their only option is to like attack the other party on like character and like delay them instead of like actually addressing the issues, since like the 49% don't really have an actual say. Okay, and then they talked about like how we can't address immediately pressing issues. First of all, parties will need to like address these immediately pressing issues, since like generally if they don't do this, they'll just be seen as like doing nothing and stuff. So like they'll need to address these issues, since it looks bad if they're like arguing over like how much like social like bailouts to give or whatever when people are dying of COVID. There'll be like an immediate aid package given. For example, like in Hurricane Sandy, President Obama, like they made a massive aid deal between President Obama, a Democrat, and like the Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. This is a prime example of how quick action can be released that benefits like both parties, both sides of the big little aisle evenly when you have this like collaboration. Okay, so yeah, I think on legislation, I think we win quite clearly since we see both parties viewed, and we actually reduce like the terrible things like that are the filibuster and whatever that actually delay legislation. Now I'll just move on to polarization. We gave you several lines of analysis on polarization. We talked about like top level government officials working together, less incentive to attack based on the fact that you're going to have to work on them later, less bad rhetoric, parties are more reliant on each other. And then fifthly, the only thing that like parties can actually work together now instead of attacking, when previously they just had to attack the other party since they had no say. In terms of response here, we just say that parties will get angry because they're held down by the other one. I think at our worst, this is symmetric, because on their side of the house, you have like Ted Cruz reading Dr. Seuss or whatever to filibuster a vote on gun control, since bipartisanship isn't normalized on their side of the house. That's what they get, and that's a terrible harm. You can't POI, it's past 1 minute left. Okay, I think further to this, we see radical bad faith actors removed insofar as that when we normalize bipartisanship, if you're like a bad faith actor, like for example, Ted Cruz, you'll just be slammed in the media and everyone and your colleagues and like the public as a whole will detest you. Then they came our way to this point that like people we push to extremes. We tell you that like they'll just meet in the center anyway, and that parties won't undermine their values to such a significant degree. I think we win this debate on the basis they never engage with our principle at all. We win off that alone. And I think on polarization, the flow-ons mean we win legislation. So proud to affirm.
Yeah.
24 minutes of analysis from opposition, and I'm still unclear what would happen in the midst of COVID when we have David Seymour, who doesn't even believe COVID's a thing, doesn't even believe that it hurts people, and equally we have Auntie Cindy, who wants to go into lockdown tomorrow afternoon. How on earth are these two people going to compromise? Are they going to lock down in 6 months? 6 months is too late. These decisions need decisions to be made now, not in 6 months. We want to protect people, protect democracy on our side of the house. Cool. So 3 main questions today in the House. Firstly, whether these bills will be passed. Secondly, whether they get polarization. And thirdly, whether it's democratic. Note that I've put whether bills will be passed first, because if we win instantly, if we prove that I'm not their side of the House, they can't pass bills fast, or they can't pass bills full stop, which get changed. Then these second 2 points don't really matter. If I prove the first one, they just extend the margin. Cool. Now for the first point of clash in today's debate on whether bills will be passed. Because we've heard from opposition that I hope these outcomes and policies that we pass will be like a mix of the best ideas. People will be really, really happy with the decision. 2 main responses here. First is just that the aim of the democratic process is to solve problems that are happening in the world. The likelihood of opposition collaborating is extremely low. They have ideas that are at odds, right? The National Party doesn't even believe that climate change is a thing. The Labour Party believes we need to make changes today. How are they going to make a decision? Is it going to be 6 months? We're going to cut the emissions down by 1%. That is not going to make change. They're just going to sit there, make a decision, arguing, creating horrible things for our society, because these people don't agree. Everyone's going to be like, why is no solutions going to be made? Our world will be on fire. The National Party will put their foot down, don't even care, because they don't need to be voted in. There's going to be some radical party who can just put their foot down. No solutions will be occurred. The second point is even if we do get solutions, even if they do make compromises, these compromises are going to be extreme, because this party wants to solve climate change. This party doesn't care about climate change. That means the solutions they're going to make doesn't really solve the problem, right? These solutions will be really watered down. This is bad because firstly, it doesn't solve the outcome. It puts a whole bunch of money in things that don't need to be solved. It's like a national coming out and saying electric vehicles will solve climate change. Electric vehicles don't solve climate change. We need corporate tax, a whole bunch of those things. Labour votes for those. National doesn't. That means on national, when they're working together, no solutions are being made. We're getting solutions that don't really solve it, tokenistic solutions, just because they can get both sides supporting on it. Our side of the House is better because they act in the best interest of the country. If they see a problem that they can solve, for example, climate change, if tomorrow there's a massive tsunami, on their side of the House, they have to talk about discussions, think about what we're going to do. On our side of the House, they can make immediate change. That is really fundamental, because as soon as you make immediate change, that is what matters in today's debate. That is what we get, what opposition doesn't. At the end of this, they're completely lost because they can't actually make decisions. Decisions that they do make is a compromise. No one likes compromises. Compromises doesn't solve the solution in the first place. We also heard from opposition that more representation is better for the nation as a whole. Neither side gets full control. That's really good. My first point here is just people feel really unsatisfied because no good policy is passed, right? Labour may claim they're going to pass this and National may claim they're going to pass this. When neither of them get passed, people are going to be well, why the hell do we have a politics? And why the hell do we have a party in power if they're not even going to pass a solution that achieves the solutions? My second response here is just people feel really terrible because the party who nobody likes, this radical party, now has a huge say. Right? If there's a whole bunch of white old men living in the Middle East, not in the Middle East, the middle of nowhere, sorry, has a party, they get 1 seat, that means they can put their foot down. They don't care about little things. So this little party that nobody likes other than 20 old men have now a huge power, because that's what's going to happen. We have radical people in our society. As soon as this one small group puts their foot down, they have to make compromises. They have to all work together. They have to go to this radical party. They have to be how are we going to find solutions? How are we going to include you? You literally can't have Labour and rednecks working together. The solution is no solution at all. We also heard from opposition that if for example, if a minority party doesn't like policy, it can't pass. That's actually really harmful because yes, they may some parties may get a good say, but the thing is because it's going to be equal on both sides. If there's an extreme left party, there's going to be an extreme right party. How do you expect these minor parties say Party Maori and act to work together? They don't. Their fundamental core is different. They cannot come to any solutions. The solution they come to will only affect the middle, white middle people who both sides can agree on. That's really harmful because that means there's no solutions. At the end of this, we've shown you that there's going to be no solutions. There's solutions that are made, compromises. No one feels happy. No solution is solved. I'll quickly take PY if opposition's got one.
Let's say hypothetically in the next election, Chris Luxon wins, and now Chris Luxon is trying to push back through some legislation that's not good for the environment. isn't it now a suddenly good thing that Labour can like push through this compromise and try and get some like?
Well, listen, he's got an incentive to do the best interest of the country. If the country's going through massive harms, he can do that, right? He's got best interest of looking after the country, getting more votes. If like environment's a really big thing, which it is, Christopher Luxon's already campaigned on this. This is happening on a status quo. He's not some radicalist, otherwise he'd be advertising on it and nobody would vote for him. Cool. Now for this point about whether we get polarization, because this is why we push the margin, right? Because we prove that they get a whole bunch of polarization, and that means we win by like a 3-point win. Cool. We've heard from opposition that it looks really good when people work together. They love working together. It's really harmonious. 3 responses here. First is just that they wouldn't work together. They've got contradicting ideas. If they don't, and then the fact is they don't need many voters to actually get in, right? That means they've got no one holding them accountable. A minority party could literally just hold down and put their foot down. This means like there's nobody holding them accountable. They can just go in and do what they like. My second response here is what they just want their ideologies to pass. Like David Seymour wants to put corporate tax, Sydney wants to put social credit. You can't have 2 decisions that get the same outcome. This means one side's going to have to make compromise. That side's going to look really weak. No one's going to vote for that side. They're going to get like no means, which means one side has to like, it's probably going to be the left. It's going to have to like go with the corporate tax, do like really harmful things. That means their voters aren't going to vote for them. We've got a society who's like, where is my left party? My left party can't even make stuff. My third response here is like, as soon as like one single party puts their foot down, as soon as David Seymour puts his foot down on banning conversion therapy, you can't do it. David Seymour's so set in his traditional mind, he's not going to change it just because Jacinda Ardern's telling him to. He doesn't really care about his voters. His voters are still going to support for him because his voters don't want conversion therapy either. He gets voted by these traditionalist people. They're not going to change on their side. We just heard this idea that just looks really bad to argue. One response here, both sides want their outcomes pushed. They don't really care if they argue. They're arguing for their political ideologies. These people vote for them because of their political ideologies. They're willing to argue. They don't really care about looks as long as people still vote for them and they're getting their left or right wing stuff. Cool. Also, they talk about like understated point. There's like people can pass a bill and it gets like repealed in 3 years. My first response here is just like these parties want to get back in power. They're going to pass bills that actually help the country. They're going to pass like better bills who actually like benefit the country. Like people aren't going to take this away. This is like really good stuff for our fundamental society. My second response is like these parties just want the best interest of the country. They want because they want policies that can like withstand change. Like for example, Obamacare is still standing even though Donald Trump was in there for 3 years. And if they like repeal and get out of like Paris Agreement, for example, the party that comes in next can just put them back. Like yes, like under opposition side, they can make no decisions. They don't actually get any of these stuff being passed. They can't agree to like making the legislation because they're like probably from different areas of the life. So at the end of this point, what we've shown you is that there's going to be so much polarization because people don't really want to work together. They want their ideologies pushed. That's the biggest incentive happening then. At the end of that point, we've won that because we've literally proven that when you have a whole bunch of different ideas, there's going to be polarization. They want their own ideologies to be pushed. They don't like, and their voters will still support them, even if they're really radical. Cool. Now for this last point of clash on whether it's democratic, because opposition has tried to win here, but it doesn't really matter if it's like necessarily democratic if they can pass those solutions in the first place. Cool. 3 main responses here. First is just like, as Nick said, there's an election every 3 years. They can kick out terrible. Like likelihood of good policies, it's very likely because they have to campaign on it. If people don't like what they're campaigning on, they just don't get voted in. Secondly, it's just like there's an incentive in the party, so like look after the whole population. Even if they pass like a legislation that like only helps like some people, that's got trickle-on effects. You know, they want to like if there's like a tax cut that helps a whole bunch of people, that has like social things coming off it. So like it helps the whole population. Thirdly, is just like the likelihood of winning by like low majority is low, because they try to say like 51 and 49 split. The likelihood of that happening is very low. It's normally like 60-40. Under our side of the house, that 40% still has a really good say. That is what we get under opposition side. No things are happening. These people aren't getting a really good say. No decisions are being made. Nobody's listening to them. So at the end of this debate, what we've proven to you is that firstly, opposition gets no like actual decisions being made. Secondly, they get a whole bunch of polarization. And thirdly, we're democratic under our side. We give everyone a say. These like minority parties can debate, can like hold things in Congress. So at the end of this point, we win because we're so proud to stand for democracy and things that are actually democratic and actually achieve the best aims of the country. So proud to do this.
The affirmative teams continued maintaining that they get better representation and therefore can principally claim the benefits of democracy, even though we've told you down the line that the compromises reached in their best case aren't truly representative of the intentions of parties and therefore those who voted for them at the times negotiations commenced. Firstly, then, on the quality of decisions made, this has been a major point of clash throughout the course of the debate. We've heard from the affirmative team that parties will pass legislation cooperatively and that they take into account all voices and get better representation. On this cooperation point, we've told you again and again that parties are fundamentally opposed to each other. They literally just want to get the outcomes that are suitable to their voter base. They're just going to push and push to get that in hopes of getting re-elected or getting that position, maintaining their positions of power. In terms of taking into account all voices and getting better representation, we've also heard that they'll create reasonable compromises, again, in F's best case. We tell you that compromises result in policies which are outside the original intention, which parties entered with, right? And the example which I've given you is expenditure, where you have to choose between two extremes. We tell you, and we've also mechanized how it takes more time to make decisions, and also literally just the difficulty of making these compromises when you've got inherently opposed parties both fighting it out to get their legislation, their views on legislation passed. So we win this point by demonstrating that even if those perfect compromises are made at the perfect time, again being F's best case, they are they're profoundly ineffective. Again, that is what all of F's cases hinged on, because they've claimed that they're going to get those perfect get those compromises as their ways of creating all their benefits, and also they've as that being the medium through which they claim all the benefits of being more democratic. Note how long they've persisted with that with that principal point. We've shown you really simply here that even if this is achieved, they don't get that representation because people don't actually get what they wanted in the start, in the first place. That's what democracy is all about. Secondly, then, on the level of political divisions, something that's come up frequently throughout the course of the debate. We've been told that parties will want to be seen as the good guy in terms of creating smooth compromises. We've also been told, again, we've been told that opposition is more divisive if they're not the ones in power, or if they don't have any means of being in power and deliberating with the other parties. Again, we tell you that parties just want to get the outcomes which are preferable to their voter base, and they care about that more than just being seen as the good guy. You're going to provide more tangible benefits for yourself when you directly target those voters which you try to appeal to. That's what you're going to be factoring in into how you approach the decision-making process, AFIS tried to claim as a benefit. You care about how your voter base is going to see you, perhaps how more people you're just targeting on trying to expand your voter base as much as you can. You don't care about being seen as the good guy. Also, we tell you that when parties gain power, we've told you about how the stakes of their argument is going to be increased. This is a mechanism which we were given to you right at the start, which has been responded to. We tell you that arguments are going to become more vicious because now opposition parties are literally deliberating the course of a country's future, especially for those really big issues like climate change. They're literally arguing with major stakes. We tell you that parties are ultimately just trying to fight to get their way. Voters then see that, and that creates that sense of division for them, because they literally see these two opposing parties battling it out on the national stage, trying to literally choose the course, the best course for their country. We tell you that voters are going to see that, they're going to take it upon themselves to go out there and be hugely intolerable and divisive toward those with opposing views, in the same way that they see these two parties literally arguing and forcing their voter outcomes which they so badly want. And so all of that results in this really negative voter perception, increasing political divide, and all that harm which it brings. That's why we're proud to negate.
I just like to recenter the debate about what side NEG's world actually looks like. Because what happens in their world is a majority of 51% is able to run across the minority, pass legislation that only represents the 51%, and completely screw over 49% of people. I don't think they ever once engage with the fact that this is what is possible on their side. And I think we need these checks and balances. We need this accountability to prevent that happening. I'm going to chat about two things. Firstly, the principle and why we get a more democratic system. And then secondly, just talking more practically about the outcomes to do with the capability to pass legislation. Firstly, on the principle, we know this is top level analysis insofar as we prove that we get a more democratic system that serves to represent more people and bring more tangible outcomes in legislation that benefits more people across society. We simply just do not care about anything else in this debate. I think what we told you was simple. We told you that we provide a broader policy of representation insofar as that even if you are not in the 51% and you're in the 49%, your vote is not wasted like it is inside NEG's world, and your vote can go towards this minister in the cabinet, the capability that they now need to reach a supermajority to pass the bill, and it can still stand as some sort of figurehead against the beliefs or the beliefs of the other people. You still have some way to hear your voices heard if your vote goes to waste. I think the problem with the principle, the problem with NEG's response to the principle is that A, they didn't really engage with it, and B, their response was that most of this legislation is going to be extremely watered down as a consequence of this, and that's not really representative. I think watered down legislation that represents more people across society is preferable to legislation that only represents the 51%. Yes, it may be slightly watered down, but it appeals to a broader group of society. I think we're hit on the principle. Next, let's talk about the capability to pass legislation. I just want to do two things of framing at the start of this clash. The first is that they try and frame this clash as this account, the accountability that we have and the checks and balances as an impedance on progress. But I know we asked them in the POI and we pointed out to the fact that this can also be an impedance on conservative happening. Therefore, I don't think they can frame this debate as being a massive harm against progressivism when it can equally be a massive benefit to progressivism to prevent these massive conservative norms being passed. We pointed this out in the POI. They didn't really engage with it. So I think it really cuts both ways with the capability to allow progress to happen. The second thing was I think they were extremely uncharitable of what this checks and balances look like. I don't think we ever stated that we're going to be letting David Seymour outright block legislation. Yes, he's a minor party. Yes, he'd have some say, maybe a cabinet minister, but he's not going to be the person that they need to get the approval of to pass this law. I thought that was extremely uncharitable on that level. Right. Under legislation, why do we tell you that parties have incentives to pass legislation, compromise, and work together? Firstly, we told you about the stuff about polarization and how polarization is a direct cause of this lack of compromise, as it now becomes a politically good thing to do to appeal to your voters to not work alongside them. And we told you that crucially, polarization was a symptom of a lack of representation in people within the system. We told you that governments, officials, now work together across parties. They vote together on bills. We also told you that it's now a bad faith tactic to engage with debate and harm, rip people out that you're working with on legislation. And we also told you that there's no other means. The reason polarization occurs is because there's no other means for minority parties to actually make a meaningful say within politics. They just resort to attacks. Our world would give the opportunity to pass legislation, and they can actually feel engaged in the process. Insofar as that we remove polarization, there's no longer a massive political demand for people to have this massive division and impose each other. I think in terms of in addition to this, we also provide you incentives as to why parties are likely to compromise. Firstly, it looks really bad faith to not engage with voting. Secondly, you get kudos from being the party who compromises, takes the higher ground. And we told you that crucially, if a party stands against something really conservative and blocks a bill on climate change opposing, they're going to massively tank their votes in the next election because that's just simply what people do not want. I think we're still capable of passing legislation, and the legislation that is passed is well thought out, and it will not be repealed when the next election, the next prime minister is elected for an executive order. On the grounds of that, incredibly proud to affirm.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so
guys.
much.
Thanks, guys.
Well done. You guys did amazing.
You guys did really well too.
Yeah, no,
Great
good job.
debate.
Yeah.
Nice. What did you think about that motion? Were you guys as confused as we were?
Oh,
Yeah.
we hated it at first.
Yeah, so do we.
Yeah.
I mean, there's such big words there. It's too late for that.
I know. So.
I know. I was looking at the word executive, like, what does this mean?